thanks for giving us time. Before beginning, I'd just like to introduce you to our viewers. Professor Edoardo Celeste is Assistant Professor of Law, Technology, and Innovation at the School of Law and Government, Dublin City University. He's also the Program Director of Erasmus Mundus Masters in Law, Data, and Artificial Intelligence Program. He's also the coordinator of Law Tech Research Cluster at DCU Law Research Center, and he is one of the founding members of Digital Constitutionalism Network. His research area includes digital rights and constitutionalism, privacy and data protection law, social media platform governance, and regulation. He has been, one of the pioneers in the area of digital constitutionalism. Your work has immensely inspired me, especially while I was doing my grad studies, and I could not had an interaction with you during my PhD. Thanks a lot, Professor, for giving us time. And to begin with, I would like to know from an Indian perspective, what what was the driving force behind you taking this digital constitutionalism research as a grad student or as a law scholar? How it all happened? Can you give us a brief insight into it?
Absolutely. So good afternoon, everyone, and let me thank Dr. Manazir, of course, for inviting me to this online conversation. I'm absolutely delighted, in any case, to share my thoughts about digital constitutionalism with Indian colleagues and students as well. So what drove me actually to start the research on digital constitutionalism? So that was actually now several years ago in 2014, and it was when I'm originally from Italy, and I was there at the time. And there was an initiative from the then president of the Chamber of Deputies, the Italian Chamber of Deputies, that decided to create an ad hoc committee on digital rights and principles. And one of their aims was indeed to draft an Italian declaration of digital rights and principles. And I remember that the Chamber of Deputies published an open consultation document, and everyone actually could provide an input from the general population. That was an online document. And I remember that the session of this ad hoc committee, that was a multi-stakeholder committee composed of academics, industry representatives, politicians, NGOs, and so on. The sessions of this committee actually were available online as well. So this captured actually my interest. And in particular, I was interested in the use of a specific terminology in their conversations, and that was the constitutional terminology. So my first impression was that is as if this group of eminent academics and experts were trying actually to establish a constitution for the internet environment. So this actually prompted me to start a research about this initiative. And this is when I realized that this was not only confined to Italy, but this was part of a sort of like a broader movement in a lot of like countries and a lot of different contexts, and not necessarily at institutional level as in Italy, but might have been, for example, in the context of an NGO or a group of academics. A lot of declarations of rights for the internet environment were emerging, and the scholarship actually called these declarations as internet bills of rights. And this I started therefore studying this text, and therefore I decided actually to build sort of like a theory on it. So this prompted me a series of questions. I don't want to anticipate the rest of the conversation, but these questions included, for example, okay, but why are these declarations emerging right now? Why do we need new principles and values for the digital society? why are these conversations taking place outside institutionalized processes? So why they're not, for example, discussed in official parliamentary meetings, in international fora? Why is up to academics? Why is up to sort of like semi-institutional settings to discuss these various issues? And this series of questions actually led me to elaborate a theory of digital constitutionalism. I've not been the inventor of the term digital constitutionalism. This term had already been used actually before me, but what I tried to do was actually to reinterpret the meaning of this term. And in a nutshell, the theory of digital constitutionalism is a theory that posits the start of a new time for constitutionalism, what I call a constitutional moment, where essentially, because the constitutional ecosystem is struggling to address the challenges of the digital revolution. Therefore, we need some changes. The constitutional ecosystem itself is reacting by elaborating new rules, new principles that potentially address the challenges of the digital revolution.
Okay, it's quite a interesting insight about your journey. Professor, can you just tell us, you have been a coordinator for the Law and Tech Research Cluster, you have been founding member of Digital Constitutional Network. Can you just give us a brief insight into the kind of work these two centers or setups are doing?
Absolutely. So when I started actually my research on digital constitutionalism, I have to say that I was among the few scholars worldwide to have an interest in this. And especially at the beginning, there was a lot of criticism to this project as well, because as you know, constitutionalism and generally constitutional law is a concept that is pretty much anchored to the state dimension. While one of my main core theses was actually that today constitutionalism needs necessarily to be projected also beyond the state. On a global perspective, indeed, states are not the only actors that play a constitutional role, but we can also, for example, mention the important role exercised by private companies. And this is why I argue that constitutional rules in the digital environment need also to address these actors. So in light of this, progressively, I try to establish a relationship, collaboration with other researchers, especially across disciplines. I'm a legal scholar myself. However, I work in close partnership with political scientists, sociologists, communication studies scholars, computer scientists as well. And what we essentially observed is that we were analyzing the same phenomenon, but using very different terms. So this is actually what prompted me to found together with other researchers, the Digital Constitutionalism Network, which is indeed a network of researchers from different disciplines that is interested in digital constitutionalism, broadly speaking. So the network is currently hosted by the Center for Advanced Internet Studies of Bochum in Germany. We meet regularly, especially online throughout the year, and it's sort of like a warm invite to everyone is to join our mailing list, because we organize regular monthly meetings discussing papers related to digital constitutionalism. And actually, Dr. Manazir had the opportunity to present at one of our meetings on digital constitutionalism, in specifically focusing on an Indian perspective as well. So this is the main task then of the Digital Constitutionalism Network. Same collaborative endeavor and open approach, which is taken by the DCU Law and Tech Research Cluster. So this is an institutional research center here in Dublin, at Dublin City University, Ireland. What we do indeed is to cross-disciplinary boundaries, to establish collaborations with colleagues, especially from sort of like with the tech background, computer scientists particularly. We organize events. We publish a series of blog posts. We are now currently establishing a working paper series. What we aim to do is to foster the global conversation on law and technology, with a specific focus on issues related to digital rights, data protection and privacy, social media, law, and governance.
That's very interesting. I mean, it's a lot of work that you are doing, kind of contribution that you are putting up for digital rights and digital constitutionalism. Am I audible to you?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Am I audible to you?
Yes, I think there is a slight delay, but now I can hear you and I can see you as well.
Okay, fine. So if you want, I can reconnect it, or if I can continue. I mean, if I'm completely fine, my visibility is there and sound is there, I can continue, or I can reconnect it.
Well, if you want, you can continue.
Okay, fine. Like, I was going through your work, and I remember at one of your blogs or research paper that you mentioned that digital constitutionalism embodies the idea of projecting value of contemporary constitutionalism in the context of digital society. Would you like to elaborate the whole notion to our viewers regarding the value system for contemporary constitutionalism?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this question, because this is absolutely central to my main thesis. So I remember that one of the main criticisms that was originally moved to my theory of digital constitutionalism was about the novelty of digital constitutionalism. One of the questions that I was continually asked was, for instance, whether is digital constitutionalism something new? Does it represent a sort of like revolution of contemporary constitutionalism? And my answer to this is very clear. It is not. Digital constitutionalism is not a revolution. It, of course, addresses the problems, the challenges generated by a revolution, which is the digital revolution. But we are not reinventing the wheel. We're not establishing a completely new ideology or a completely new theory. Digital constitutionalism, in my opinion, is rather a sort of like a new layer, a new strand of contemporary constitutionalism, an evolution, if you want. So what it means is that essentially constitutionalism is now a theory, an ideology that has been followed across the world in the past few centuries, of course, some countries before than others. And is essentially rooted in the idea of having constitutional rights, very often a document called constitution, which has sort of like a superior standing in the hierarchy of legal sources, which should guide the development of the law and the development of the legal system at large. And constitutionalism is a concept that has evolved, is an ideology that has evolved over time. So progressively, constitutionalism, at the origin, for example, constitutionalism was about limiting the power of the stronger actors, the most powerful actors of the society, that was originally the monarch or the aristocracy. Then constitutionalism also embedded the idea of democracy, therefore, of course, articulated in different way, but a concept which was very far from absolute monarchy that characterized the early origin of constitutionalism. And then progressively, beyond this dimension of balancing powers within the society, it also encompassed the protection of fundamental rights. And here, essentially, this is the recent history of constitutionalism of the past, let's say, 150 years, where progressively men and women have fought actually to establish and to let their fundamental rights recognized in the constitutional charters, in the constitutional law of their countries. So we had like civil rights, political rights, rights potentially of further generations. And this, just to wrap up and to conclude and to address this question, I think that digital constitutionalism, what is doing at the moment is essentially to translate, to make these principles, which are part of the principles of contemporary constitutionalism, evolving in order to address the challenges of the digital revolution. So digital constitutionalism indeed is preserving the DNA of contemporary constitutionalism, but is trying to translate these principles using the new language and taking into account the peculiarities of the digital society.
Okay. That thanks a lot. I mean, this was the sentence that I always wanted to, have an elaborate discussion with you, and it's much clearer now. Doubt, I have this curiosity when I go through your work, and when you talk about differentiation between digital constitutionalism and constitutionalization of digital environment, and you differentiate between those two. Uh, how do you see, constitutionalization of public sphere at democracies where fundamental rights are still evolving, or in countries where they actually do not have constitution, they do not have a running democracy, they have a different form of government, or in countries which are going through turmoil, or in countries, because when I read political science and philosophy, I feel there's a whole notion of fundamental right is ever evolving. Like in one of your papers, I remember I wrote a mail to you that one of your papers you have talked about how if a public servant is blocking someone who's asking question to the person, it's like dividing that person from the fundamental right of questioning the public servant. And now when I compare that situation your that perspective in a global southeast perspective, I mean that is an idea which is very clear, which is yet to be evolved in Indian perspective. So how do you see the constitutionalization of digital environment in different demographies?
This is an extremely interesting question, and I hope to provide my view, despite the fact that I have to admit that I'm not a political scientist, so I will provide you the perspective of a legal scholar on this. So first of all, you're perfectly right. In my writings, I've distinguished the concept of constitutionalism, digital constitutionalism, and constitutionalization of the digital environment. In a nutshell, what I argue is that constitutionalism is a set of ideals, values, principles that are progressively implemented, translated in a process of constitutionalization. So the other way around, if you want, the constitutionalization is the process which is informed, guided by the values of digital constitutionalism. And is a progressive process, step by step. Constitutional systems are adapting to face the challenges of the digital revolution. Now, your question is very pertinent and essentially ask about, okay, what are the differences between, for example, democratic, non-democratic countries and so on. So, of course, the process of constitutionalization is not homogeneous everywhere. It varies depending on the context. So what it means is that in some countries, for example, it might be at one stage, and in other countries, it might be at a more kind of like progressive stage. What is certainly true is that digital technology is a powerful democratizing sort of like capacity. The internet allows millions of individuals to spread their own opinions and beliefs on the net. And this is an element that is not to be underestimated when it comes to assess, for example, the process of democratization of specific countries. So certainly we could say that in non-democratic countries, a process of democratization might be ongoing if a process of constitutionalization of the digital environment is protected as well. Why? Because, for example, if freedom of expression is protected online, which is one of the main sort of like articulations of digital constitutionalism, it also means that people are free to express their own opinions, and it means that a democratic awareness of a country might improve. On the other hand, it's also true that constitutionalization might not be hand in hand with democratization. And this happens when essentially governments and totalitarian governments have sort of like a monopolistic control of the constitutional agenda. So in that case, rather than drawing a parallel between constitutionalization and democratization, constitutionalization of the digital environment becomes more a synonym of securitization, for example. So where totalitarian, for example, regimes try to erect barriers across their sort of like along the line of their virtual boundaries in order to isolate their own countries. So on the one hand, of course, people within these boundaries might feel more protected, for example, against some potential violations of their fundamental rights, cyber threats. But it's also true that their fundamental rights, their democratic rights, civil and political rights are curtailed. So we cannot actually speak of a full constitutionalization in the sense that contemporary constitutionalism would imply. Indeed, what we have to mention is that while at the very beginning the idea of democracy was not 100% part of the idea of constitutionalism, because as I said, historically constitutionalism also emerged in monarchical context, non-democratic context. Today, democracy is indeed an integral part of the DNA of contemporary constitutionalism.
Actually, like it was very insightful. I mean, this was a new perspective to whole understanding. And I would love to expand which I've heard from you in form of paper in days to come. Uh, Now, like you have been working upon a lot of projects which is related to user data privacy, and you have been writing about that in a lot of work of yours. How do you see the whole discourse, especially when I was trying to understand data privacy regulation from a South Asian perspective. I realized so we had one regulation that came in European Union, and then what we saw in South Asia that most of the time we saw countries just simply copy pasting things from the main regulatory framework. And how do you see that perception of using one regulatory framework as one fits to all approach when the democracy itself in nations are evolving and they are at various levels? Do you think it is a good practice, or do you think it will have a counter effect at the end of the day as far as regulations are concerned? How do you see this approach? I mean, it's a very critical question, but then I want to have a very legal perspective from you.
Sorry, Sharique, I think that I missed the first part of the question. I could not hear you. If you could repeat the first part, please.
Okay, so what I said was, when we talk about personal data protection and regulations related to it, and first we had regulation in European Union, and when then we saw across the globe, especially in South Asia, where different countries are right now at various stages of formulating their own data protection regime, and when you go as a legal scholar or a grad student who has been specializing into it, when you look at it, from a close distance, you realize that it's a more or less conceived from what GDPR regulation that EU has formulated. But when we see this one regulation fits all approach, and when we know that democracies are at various stages in various countries, so fundamental rights are much more explained in constitutionally when you talk about European nations, or when we compare to South Asian nations or Middle Eastern nations, so things are still evolving. So how do you see the after effects? So this whole approach of one regulation fits all, or the approach of taking inspiration from one regulation and simply putting it on paper. Is it going to help the constitutionalization of digital regime, or will it have a counter effect in long run in nations where democracy is still evolving?
Many thanks for this fascinating question. It actually allows me to combine two of my main research interests of the past few years. Indeed, with two colleagues of mine, I recently edited a book which is entitled Data Protection Beyond Borders. And indeed, it reflects from a transatlantic perspective, drawing a comparison between like EU and US regulation about the extraterritorial effect of data protection law in these two jurisdictions. So you're perfectly right. Indeed, EU data protection law has an extraterritorial effect. And what I would say is that on top of it, there is what the scholarship has called the Brussels effect. So it's essentially EU law taken as a model by other countries and followed by other countries, and foreign companies having almost the pressure or the expectations in any case to abide by EU rules. So on the one hand, this is certainly welcome in the sense that, especially in countries where regulations related to the digital field are completely absent, having this sort of like external effect might definitely be beneficial. The only problem is that, and these, from this point of view, I think early studies of comparative law have clearly established that legal transplants do not work. So what we cannot do is to pretend to take the European GDPR and copy and paste it, for example, in Indian law or in the law of other countries. As you said, the specificities of the legal framework, of the constitutional framework, of the society itself of these countries have to be taken into account. What is interesting to notice is that actually the GDPR does not requires, for example, from a data transfer perspective, the other countries to have exactly the same data protection framework, but that framework should be deemed as adequate by the European Commission, which essentially means that other countries may find their own way of articulating, of protecting fundamental rights related to privacy and data protection, being at the same time while offering an adequate protection of personal data. So certainly diversity is possible. But what I think is more important, especially because, as you have highlighted, the status of the conversation in different countries is very, very different. I think is extremely important to foster global conversation, collaboration, and exchange about these issues in order to raise awareness among law and policymakers about the real problems, the trends, and also to clarify and maybe to agree on the common aims of these regulations. Indeed, what I'm particularly worried by recent trends is that recent regulations are there to support and protect the particular specific interest of governments, states, or private corporations, and very often do sacrifice fundamental rights on the altar of economic efficiency and economic profit. What I would like, and I really hope we will see in the future, is actually global conversation that will unanimously state that fundamental rights, protection of fundamental rights, is the primary objective of these new regulations, and the other interest come as a sort of like a second-class priorities.
Yeah, I mean, you just, you just explained to what I just wanted to have perspective from you. Professor, there's this one question I always had, and that is not related to your paper, but then I do, because Europe is a large market when you talk about user data, and then we have, if we kind of not take China into account, India is, I think, probably one of the first, second, or third largest user data market, or user database, if you would like to say in a legal, correct legal term. Why do we are not seeing a lot of academic research collaboration, and why the digital democracy or digital constitutionalism research is so distant apart? There's a gap, which I feel, I mean, I could be wrong academically. There's lesser and lesser collaboration from academic front when we talk about these regulations, when we talk about collaborative approach. Where do you see the problem is? Why, I mean, like, is it not necessary actually at all, or do you see it as it being important, but then something is not happening? Where do you see the problem lies?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I do believe that actually more collaboration is needed, especially with academics and especially from an interdisciplinary perspective. Very often, indeed, legal scholars or political scientists use their own terminology, and we don't understand each other together with engineers or computer scientists. Another big problem is actually to connect the industry sector, the law and policy makers, together with the academics, and very often actually unfortunately, what we academics really like care about, such as the protection of fundamental rights, is not the primary objectives of politicians or industry representatives. In the first case, they are more interested in a sort of like day-to-day management of their own countries, and in the second case, of course, profit and economic interest is their primary objective. However, what we need to understand is that protecting fundamental rights should not be seen as a sort of like a further burden for politicians or industry, but should be embedded in their own culture. So we should not even develop services or tools which are not fundamental rights compliant, especially I think in the digital society. And why? Because in the digital society, individuals are particularly vulnerable. We need services. We are accustomed to get these services for free very quickly on our digital, very often mobile devices. We don't read, in most of the cases, for example, all the policies, information that are provided to us. And this is why actually the burden should not be on the user, but should be on the sort of like policymaker or the industry companies in order to incorporate, to embed a privacy-friendly, data protection-friendly environment in the tools that we use daily.
Yeah. The other thing is that we see a lot of transnational bodies forming up when we talk about constitutionalism. So we have a lot of we have BRICS, then you have Asian countries, then you have every set of country have their own set of group. But when we see digital regulation or digital constitutionalism, even from academic perspective, that collaboration has been missing, and it's been such a long while after GDPR came into existence, and it has been such a long time. How do you see things proceeding? And it's the last question.
Yeah, this is actually a very good question. I think that the GDPR was perceived not only in Europe but also beyond as a sort of like a revolutionary turning point. But what always surprised me is that in reality the GDPR was not the first piece of regulation or the first piece of legislation about the data protection in Europe. Indeed, the EU Data Protection Directive dated back from 1995, so like many years before the adoption of the GDPR. I think that nevertheless these pieces of regulations and now I can tell you, for example, in the EU, there are new important pieces of regulations that are forthcoming, such as the new Artificial Intelligence Act or the Digital Market and Digital Services Acts. These new pieces of regulation are important because they increase the awareness in the market, in the society at large, and they foster a conversation, I think, about digital rights. What I do really hope is that outside of Europe, policymakers and the industry will not perceive the proactiveness of the European policy as a sort of like attempt to colonialize, for example, or to export our own values, but as a way to, okay, let's come together at the table, let's discuss together, let's foster our collaboration on these mutual fields. And I definitely think that important countries such as India, which are now at the forefront of innovation and very strong from an industry perspective, I hope that we will come together and sit together at the table to discuss how to jointly develop the regulations for the forthcoming digital age.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor. I mean, it was very insightful discussion, and I hope our listener will get to learn a lot, and they can. I'll attach a few of your papers when I post the video, so that they can go through your research work, and they can. Some of you who want to contact you, they can get in touch with you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for giving us your precious time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manazir, for your invite. And I can also announce that actually my book on digital constitutionalism that will be titled Digital Constitutionalism, the Role of Internet Bills of Rights is actually forthcoming, published by Routledge. It will be out soon, so we'll be happy then to circulate the link. It will be available in open access format.
Sure, sure, sure. I'd love to read it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.